Beauty can be light, loving and protective, yet beauty can also be dark, scary and malicious. So enjoy this week's case analysis with me, Dr. Fiona Gherkin. I specialise in dark personalities of women and the tactics they use to get what they want. Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode of Dark Beauty. Today we're going to be talking about a woman by the name of Istarlin Hassan. She's a 49-year-old mother of 7 from Victoria, and she created a fraudulent network to defraud government welfare programs, mainly NDIS, as well as the childcare subsidies and parenting payments. So first I'm going to give you an overview of the case and talk to you about some of the behaviours Istarlin displayed. Then I'm going to talk about the impact on people, and we're going to finish up with a summary of the dark triad traits and how Istarlin may fit with some of those traits based on her behaviour. So as I've mentioned previously, those dark triad traits that we discuss in these episodes are psychopathy, narcissism, sadism and Machiavellianism. And we'll cover those later in this episode. But let's first give a bit of an overview of the case of Istarlin Hassan. So she was accused of creating a fraudulent network that exploited multiple government welfare programs, including the childcare subsidy, parenting payments and NDIS funding from 2014. So Hassan allegedly used NDIS funds meant for her own child with a disability for personal expenses and coached others in similar fraudulent acts. She's also alleged to have set up an NDIS provider business and collaborated with another provider by the name of Annabelle to profit from exploiting individuals with disabilities. The total fraudulent claims across welfare programs, including the NDIS, are estimated at $800,000. So if you're not from Australia, you may be asking, what is the NDIS? Just so you're aware, the NDIS is the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So it was about 10 years ago now that Australia decided that they needed a national scheme to support people with disability. And they did that through what they called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. I know in Tasmania, where I'm from, most disability services were funded directly by the state government and they were monitored by the state government. However, this new scheme was going to allow for a national system that allowed everyone with disability to get the support they needed. Unfortunately, the system has not gone as well as I think the government would have hoped since it was rolled out. And there's been a lot of fraudulent behaviour because it's become a system that was all about choice and control for people with disabilities. However, many people with disabilities don't have the capacity to understand if they're being defrauded. And therefore, a lot of people have come along and gone, this is a scheme where we can cheat people out of money. And a lot of people have made a lot of money as part of the scheme at the expense of people with disabilities. So it's a really sad situation. And in the case of Istarlin Hassan, she committed $800,000 worth of fraud, but there's certainly other cases that were in the millions of dollars. So from a legal perspective, she committed conspiracy to defraud. She was dishonest, causing loss to another person, and obtained financial advantage through deception. In January 2024, the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, so that's the National Disability Insurance Scheme Commission that deals with any fraudulent behaviour such as that by Hassan, and she was banned from providing services for 2 years from January 2024, which, in my opinion, should be a permanent thing. I think not providing services for 2 years when you've committed that level of fraud, I think, is a bit of a light sentence if you ask me. So let's talk about some of Istarlin's behaviours. So one of the key things that she did was she created a welfare fraud syndicate. She misappropriated funds, including those meant for her own child to support their disability. She ran a sham business as part of the NDIS, and she also diverted money that was meant for her child to luxury items for herself. So these were some of the key things that she did, and they all kind of fit under the title of fraud. When it came to the childcare scheme, this was a really interesting thing that she set up. So there were 6 other people that she lured in, 6 other mothers, I believe, that she lured in. So the childcare fraud scheme was a very interesting setup that she had, where she had a number of other families that she coached on how to defraud the childcare system. Now, how it worked was you would have one family claim that a different family looked after their children under childcare and vice versa. So it meant that on paper, they weren't actually caring for their own children. Therefore, they were paying someone else and receiving and needed a childcare subsidy. This was not the case. These families were caring for their own children, but what they were doing is they were collecting that portion of the childcare benefit that comes from the government, and they were keeping that for themselves because they really weren't looking after other people's children, they were looking after their own. Now, this was a scheme that was started around 2014 by Istarlin. She was also dishonest with Centrelink, which is our welfare system in Australia, defrauding things like parenting payments. In terms of misappropriating funds, Istarlin received funds for her child who had a disability. Now, those funds were meant for the child to help support them with their disability. It might have been a carer that comes in every day, it might have been day programs that they might have attended, or simply the services they might have needed, things like a wheelchair or different items that they needed to help support their disability. However, not all of that money was there to support her child. There are claims that she kept much of that money for herself. As a self-managed package, she could make up false invoices, and it's claimed that she spent a lot of the money on luxury items for herself, such as a house cleaning service, childcare for her own children, and even buying a home in Melbourne's north. Additionally, she also ran an NDIS business which was fraudulent and did incorporation with Annabelle from Melton. She basically exploited people with a disability for personal gain, exploiting them and not giving them the care that they were supposed to receive. So one of the key things I like to cover before I go into the dark triad traits is I like to talk about how this actually affected the victims in this case, because fraud is not a victimless crime, and I know a lot of people think it is, and I imagine there was some level of justification by Stalin to say, well, this was just government. I'm only defrauding the government. They don't matter. Well, it does. It matters to all of us. You know, it means we end up paying more tax, and it means that people that need support are not getting it. So it's not a victimless crime. So obviously there was the 6 people who had disabilities that didn't get the full level of care they actually needed under this, and that they were actually entitled to. There was obviously the broader harm of vulnerable participants. It's one thing to defraud a government, it's another to take away support that people with disability actually needed and were being supported to receive. And it really is a level of manipulation and extortion and coercion of people that are, you know, in a vulnerable state. It's also believed that she did threaten these people that she was supposed to be supporting to hand over cash for some services so that she could keep that for herself and not have to pay tax on it. One of the other things more broadly, obviously it's affected the victims in this case, but more broadly, you know, it really does diminish the trust in the NDIS system, because the system is there for a reason to help people with disability, and when people defraud the system, it's seen as a corrupt system. And I know there's been a lot of talk about that in Australia around this system, that it's too easy to commit fraud as part of the system that allows probably too much control in a system that allows people that are vulnerable to be used and abused and taken advantage of by people that are willing to commit fraud. So let's now look at the dark tetrad traits and how they relate to Istarlin and her behaviour. So let's start with narcissism. So narcissism is about grandiosity, entitlement, lack of empathy and self-importance. So in terms of her behaviour, she used NDIS funds to fund her own lifestyle, funds that were meant to support people with disabilities. This shows that she has a level of entitlement and prioritising her own comfort and life over those of vulnerable others. The fact that she ran a fraudulent business also means that she shows a desire for recognition and status as a businesswoman, even though it was through fraudulent means. I will say at this point, it always bothers me when women create a business through fraudulent means, because I think it discredits those women that do work hard to build businesses off the back of honesty and hard work. Because although there's hard work that goes into fraudulent behaviour, it's at the expense of someone else. And often that's what you see in people that have these dark traits that we often talk about on this podcast. Let's now look at Machiavellianism. So as a reminder, it's all about that strategic manipulation, deceptiveness, based on personal gain and personal success. So Stalin did orchestrate a long-term welfare fraud syndicate, which shows that there's a real level of calculated deception there. This wasn't a one-off incident. This was something that happened over a significant period of time. The fact that she was also willing to build her business off the back of collaborating with others and encouraging others to commit fraudulent behaviour as well, which shows a level of planning, manipulation. She was willing to succeed off the back of others and at the expense of others, and that really fits in with that Machiavellian way of working and way of succeeding. Let's now look at how she might have fit in with the psychopathic traits. So that's where someone is really unempathetic, they're quite callous, they're impulsive, they have take no responsibility for their own actions, and they certainly lack remorse around their behaviour. So in terms of Istarlin, she denied adequate care to 6 people with disabilities for her own financial gain, which shows a level of callousness and disregard for the suffering of others. She certainly lacked remorse because she continued her fraudulent behaviour for a number of years over a number of welfare organisations to continue to build up funds. She also used those funds for personal gain, which shows a level of selfishness and that narcissism component of psychopathy, that lack of ability to reflect on how her behaviour affects others. Let's talk about the last of the dark tetrad traits, and that's sadism, and that's where people enjoy being cruel to others, that they get pleasure in the pain of others. So there's no direct evidence that she was overtly sadistic in any way or that she enjoyed causing harm to others. However, there is that indirect sadism that kind of fits in terms of inflicting indifference and a lack of care for others and exploiting others. So there is some element there, but I don't think it's an overt sadism. I think it fits in with some of those other categories such as narcissism and psychopathy. This would only really fit if she actually harmed participants for her own personal gain. But as with the dark tetrad trait, and it's why I cover all of them, there's often elements of each one that seem to meld together in most of these cases. And it's really just the degree that varies. So to sum up the case in terms of the dark tetrad traits, Istarlin Hassan certainly was strong in Machiavellianism. She certainly wanted to be successful and created this long-term deception and exploitation of people that were vulnerable. She was also quite high in narcissism, so prioritising what she wanted over those of vulnerable people. She also showed psychopathic traits, disregard for others, lack of empathy, and obviously committing fraud often fits into that psychopathic sector as well. Istarlin Hassan is a really sad case because she did rope in a lot of other people to help her, and people were willing to do that. And I think that's sometimes people get a bit starry-eyed by thinking and seeing the money that they can make through these systems and often justify it to themselves. I imagine both Istarlin and the people that were included in her syndicate considered this to be a victimless crime because they were defrauding government and not individual people. But the sad thing is that people were suffering. People with disabilities weren't getting the support they needed. The money that was supposed to go to people to support people with disabilities, including her own child, were not used appropriately. And therefore people were missing out on the support they needed and the care they needed. NDIS fraud is a massive problem in Australia, and I think it's really sad that she only got a 2-year term. Fraud is running rife in the NDIS system, and I think we need to do more to combat that because it's people with disability, vulnerable people that are suffering. This system was supposed to be about them having choice and control over the support they receive to live a full and happy life. And unfortunately, wherever there is a system that's about helping others, where there is a lot of money to be made, you will always find people like Istarlin and her co-conspirators that will take advantage of that. Sadly, people with dark triad traits are everywhere, and there are a lot of women out there who are trying to succeed, who believe that succeeding as a woman is really important, and there are some amazing people out there that have succeeded in business ethically and not through using dark tetrad traits. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you really enjoyed hearing about Istarlin Hassan. This was a case that I learnt about for this episode in particular. I had heard about what was happening with her and how she was defrauding the childcare and NDIS system. It's a really sad case, and I hope that her victims can find forgiveness in what she's done. I hope the government can find forgiveness, and I hope there's a level of reflection that she's able to do now to think about her own behaviour and move forward in an ethical manner and be repentant for her behaviour. But I do pray for her, and that I hope that her and her family can move forward after this situation. Thank you everybody for listening, and make sure you follow the podcast so you know when I put a new episode out. I have been a bit slack with getting these out weekly. And I'm now on YouTube. If you haven't checked that out already, the podcasts are now also on YouTube with a static video, but also there's other videos and other content that I'm putting out on YouTube that's all around wrangling toxic women, that if you enjoy this podcast, you may also enjoy that content. It's very raw, but I hope that you enjoy it. I'm also on X if you want to follow me there. But thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode, and I hope you join me next time.